Welcome, everyone, to episode 15 of In the Hot Seat. This is the second episode in a series on AI called AI Friend or Foe. Now, for our repeat viewers, first, thanks for coming back. And if you're new to the show, every 2 weeks we put industry experts, customers in the hot seat for lively discussion, debate, even a little discourse as we try to humanize the digital experience. All aspects of the customer lifecycle are up for discussion, as well as the technologies used throughout each phase of the journey. And just a quick note, I think we still have a bit of a LinkedIn bug, so I'll mention this. If you're on LinkedIn Live streaming and you have some issues, like it makes a 30-second clip of us and keeps replaying that, while I'm sure that's pleasant, I think that you might not like that. So if you don't and you're having that problem, go to YouTube or Facebook, and either one of those two, you can watch it live there as well. So Jody, I'm excited today about this show, and we've been talking about AI and ChatGPT and all the other large language models and engines and that sort of thing for a bit, and part of this series we wanted to look at B2B, B2C, education, which we did in the last show, and one of the topics that I feel like particularly interesting when you start to think about B2B. Is the question of privacy and data security, and that's if we think of the use case that is bringing that large language model and connecting it to our own enterprise data sources, whatever those might be, that seems to me like that opens up some interesting opportunities, but also some challenges. I mean, what do you think about that, Jody? I mean, privacy, security.
What's interesting for me is, if we go back several years and we think about the impact that GDPR, CASL, HIPAA, all of those regulations had on all of the industries, and how we had to change what we were doing in our processes because of those regulations. AI came into the mix today, and I mean, it detonated in a way what we had in place, right? Because now things are changing so fast, so rapid. I mean, tools are coming out and people are going on and testing without even really understanding the implications of what they're giving up from personal data. So I think, this is a huge pivotal turning point in how we are marketing to, doing business with, engaging with customers. Whether you're business or consumer, AI is going to have a lot of impact, and some of that impact is going to be negative and some of it's going to be positive. So I'm really excited to talk with our guest today, because she's going to bring so much insight into this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's there's a ton of opportunity, like I said, and I think it's easy to jump past some of the other issues and think, oh, gee, we can use this to improve customer experience and conversational AI, et cetera. And I think all those are true. And I've been playing, just like everybody else, I've been playing with ChatGPT and Bard and others. I've used it to write some things and help do some research around some things, and it's interesting. But I think in the context of it being a tool that I use that's public, I think that's fine, right? I mean, there's no real risk there. But if you take it further and you put it in the business, that opens up a bunch of potential, definitely risk, I guess, that we need to think about as we go forward.
Well, we think about it in terms of content from the physical piece that is generated, be that text or images, but take it a step further and think about the voice. Think about the biometrics. Yeah. There's a lot of angles there that this plays into, and it's going to be great to hear things that we might need to think about as we're going down this path.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And obviously we've been talking about privacy regulations for a bit, and Europe led the way there with GDPR, and there's a bunch of states that have done some things, but it's a little bit of a mishmash in the US around privacy and security too, frankly. So, that certainly is another piece that we want to dig into when we get into this. So before we bring in the guests, though, just one more quick thing. And I did this last week or 2 weeks ago, rather, for the education show. I figured if we're talking about ChatGPT, maybe I should use it in the show. So I did generate the questions for the first episode and also for this episode using the ChatGPT, and the prompt was, what questions would you ask a privacy security expert about integrating and using large language models into B2B use cases? So that sets it up. The questions all came straight out of ChatGPT. And so with that, I think we probably ought to stop wasting time and bring in our guest. Soribel Feliz, thought leader in the field of responsible AI and emerging tech. She's a program manager working at the intersection of democracy and technology for a big tech company. Previously, she worked for the trust and safety team at the content regulation team at Meta. And then before Meta, she was a foreign service officer for the U.S. Department of State. So welcome.
Hi, Soribel. How are you?
Hi. Thank you for having me.
Really, really glad you could join us. I'm excited to dig into this a bit. I think this is a really interesting topic and one the audience is going to be very interested in too. So I'm just just to kind of set the stage. I mean, what are the main privacy and security concerns that you think about when you're talking about integrating large language models into the business, into B2B?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are so many concerns. It's hard to say what are the main concerns, right? But the one that comes to mind, like the one that jumps out at me, is the risk that one company may share personally identifiable information with another company without the user's consent, without being transparent about sharing that data, and unknowingly violating some kind of law, some privacy law like GDPR, like CCPA, like any of these laws that are coming up from state to state, and then getting into hot water with regulators and being fined. That's just one, and also just losing trust from users, right? If it comes to my attention that you share my data with a third party that I did not authorize, I don't trust you anymore, right? And you might lose that consumer trust, which is really hard to get back.
Yeah, I mean, again, obviously, trust is a big part of a business these days, particularly in the recurring revenue subscription models and things that we're doing. So that's a huge risk in and of itself. Not to mention the regulatory risk and perhaps confusion around that as well. So, yeah, that makes sense.
Soribel, how can businesses ensure the data privacy and security when sharing information with those large language models? I mean, what should businesses be thinking about and doing to maintain that level of trust with their consumers?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few steps that businesses can take to make sure that that when they're sharing sensitive information, there's no disrespect for the consumer. That's how I see it. It's if you're sharing my sensitive information without my consent, you're disrespecting me. So how to ensure that? There's some technical ways that they can use. So, for example, encryption. And when you encrypt data, you can share data without it identifying you as a person. You can use anonymization, which is a really good tool. It's not all encompassing. It's going to protect you, right? Because any anonymized data can be de-anonymized. But it's a step, it's a measure that you can take to protect yourself, to protect your users. But on the more human side, right? You can be transparent on what data, you can be transparent with consumers on what data you're sharing and why and for what. And be really careful with the data that you're sharing. Like, for example, if you can share like my age range, but maybe you don't need to share my exact age, or you don't have to share my date of birth, or you don't have to share like some specific sensitive data that makes me identifiable. And one more thing I would say is auditing the data that you share to make sure that it's correct, that, in the GDPR sense, that it's not like, super sensitive, and that it can't come back to bite me, that it cannot be used maliciously against me.
I like the idea of thinking of it as disrespect, because I think I think at the basis level that is sort of what we're saying, right? You don't have enough respect for me to get my permission to use certain data, or to not use certain data if I don't think that's a reasonable way for you to use it. So that's interesting. I mean, I wonder, this is gonna happen, right? I mean, the GPT engines, large language models, are going to be integrated into the customer data. That's like one of the first use cases that you can see start to be valuable from a business perspective. So assuming that it is going to be that way, right? I mean, we are going to see that in business, already starting to see it, but it's going to get even more prevalent. What can businesses do to minimize that risk of data leakage and unauthorized access, particularly internally from the application perspective, but also externally with the risk of exposure?
I think we can go back to basics here, right? Like, ChatGPT is a new technology, but the same principles of cybersecurity apply. Educate your employees, so that they don't, they don't do the things that causes most of data breaches. And I would say also, practice sanitary cybersecurity, right? Like, there's phishing, there's malware, so you have to make sure that your data is protected. Really have strong contracts with third-party vendors. Make sure that they are also practicing, safe cybersecurity. Always be mindful of GDPR, CCPA, and other privacy laws. I'm only mentioning those, but there are so many privacy laws from around the world that we have to be really, really mindful of. And there's also the new things that ChatGPT inserts into the equation, which is bias, and making sure that when you're sharing, when you're sharing data, that there's no bias in there, because anyone can go in and buy a domain name and poison data by doing enough, by putting enough stuff out there that is incorrect, that is wrong. The model can pick it up and spew out incorrect data that may come back to harm me, right? So just practicing safe cybersecurity, I think that's the most important thing that a company can do.
I mean, I was listening to a podcast this morning, and as often they do lately, we're talking about ChatGPT, and one of the things that I've noticed, and I know I've had conversations with other people about this as well, is that go in and ask ChatGPT, even the most recent versions of it, to write a biography about you, and it's a little bit hit or miss. And I mean, I think I'm a fairly online person and have a lot of presence there, and yet it gave me 2 degrees that I'd never attended a school for, and it gave me 2 degrees from schools that I'd never attended. So obviously there's some risks there. So I'm just curious, like, how do you? I mean, I guess if you put this in the business environment, you're going to see more more relevant data, because you're attached to a private data source in addition to whatever the large language model looks like, right? So I guess that relieves some of that. But I mean, how does that change in respect to using it in business versus the public model? Because it will have personal data, it will have certain restricted data.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's hard to answer, but I think that's where data health comes in how companies will have to invest in auditing and testing their models for correct information, for accurate data. Um, that's the first thing that comes to mind, right?
Yeah.
Practice data health, but really like practice compliance, GDPR. And CCPA. It requires you to have up to date data. It gives users power over the data, and they can go anytime and say, "Hey, you have this incorrectly. You have to fix it." So if you conflate public data with private data that the company has, and you spew out like something completely inaccurate or incorrect about me or about anyone, that can harm me, like this professor who had supposedly had a sexual harassment case against him, which is completely fabricated, then you're liable for that because you're harming this person's reputation and career.
Mm-hmm.
So there's so much that goes in there, not just fairness, like complete do no harm, but also like you are liable for maybe a defamation suit or for a fine, for not practicing data health, for not auditing things before you put them out there.
We actually just had a question come through that I think is relevant to this part of the conversation. How can businesses that tend to depend on the information that's coming from ChatGPT appropriately filter the information that they get? And I think that kind of goes along the same train of discussion that we were just having, right? What are some things that businesses can do? I mean, at this point, ChatGPT and others, right? But I feel like a lot of us are using ChatGPT almost in the sense of a Band-Aid term, right? It's becoming generic, even though it's a product. Yeah. But any of those tools, information is going to come in. How do we filter that information? How do we know? How do we leverage the information we're getting through those tools, be able to distill that and know, how to then use that information? Are there things that we should consider putting into place for the tools like the AI tools, as opposed to on the back end in a CRM system or a BPM system?
I do think that practicing less is more is a beautiful thing at this point, because there's so much data about all of us out there, right? And I want to try that. I want to try going on ChatGPT and asking for a bio about myself, see what it says. But, for a business, if you only need a certain amount of data about me, then just take that much. Don't go out and take more than you need. And then your good data is poisoned by the bad data. And then like you get in trouble. So I'm just, thinking out loud of any company, let's say ride sharing company. Let's just say a ride sharing company. You don't need that much about me, right? Like you only need my credit card, maybe you need my gender, and maybe you need my address, but maybe you don't need more than that. So just take what you need and don't try to take everything. And again, auditing and testing. Auditing is a little bit harder, right? Because what is there? Like what's true and what's not? You may not know that, but auditing to see how much you can minimize data and just use whatever you need. Yeah.
To follow up on that, actually, we just had another question come in that I think is relevant in terms of thinking about ChatGPT in general and the other tools. Are they going to ultimately become onerous, right? When it comes to having to do all of this back end, fact checking, the making sure that everything is correct for the output. At some point, does it become too much work on the back end?
I mean, I think right now there's a lot of hype, right?
Yeah.
And everybody wants to jump on this, and nobody wants to be left behind. But I think after that hangover, people will, I think companies and people will step back and say, is this actually useful? Is this actually doing me any good? Am I losing more? Am I losing more than what I'm gaining? I mean, personally, I've used ChatGPT. I've experienced writer's block, and it may help me with like starting with the first sentence, but then it doesn't help because it's very generic. Like the things that it says is super generic. So I'm like, okay, you can help me with like the first line and maybe the conclusion. You can give me ideas, but it doesn't replace my expertise. I was writing about something completely like different, but it didn't replace my expertise and my creativity, because I have a certain style that I like to write. I'm very like sarcastic, and I try to be funny, and that doesn't replicate it. And another instance that I'm thinking about is, and I've harped on this before, is using large language models for customer service purposes, right? To replace the humans that take care of your customers. And I saw a video today posted on LinkedIn about a woman in China who had a bat, and she was batting, like she was actually beating down a robot that, and I just found it so funny. It represents all the frustrations that customers have, because customers, they want to hear from a human. They want to make sure that somebody's listening to them, that someone is there to, to solve their problems. And if you just have a, I don't care what you call it. It could be Elsie or Noe or Naomi or Natalie. I don't want to talk to her. I want to talk to a human. I want to feel heard. And I think eventually companies are going to realize that you can't just automate everything, or you're going to lose a lot of customers.
Sorry, I'm just asking all these questions. I'm going to flip right over to you, Michael, in 1 second. But just to follow up on that, when we were talking about tone, right? I think there are some really interesting tools on the market that bring tone into it from a writing perspective, and that's one area that I'm fascinated with, right? How you could take a tool that will generate content for you, but train it on the way in which you write, right? That just fascinates me, because how can something that programmatically spits out text, how does it know how Jody Spencer writes? And so when you talked about writing from a sarcastic perspective, do you think we're going to get to the point where the tone and perhaps even empathy to some degree from the customer service side can come into some of these tools? And then tying this back to the whole data privacy piece, right? That kind of starts to blur a line between automation and an actual person. Because right now we can tell when responses are coming back that it's from a bot versus a person. But what happens when this tone starts coming into it? Mm-hmm. Like, how do we need to start putting disclaimers on everything that, like, hey, this is Jody the bot, as opposed to, hey, this is Jody? Does that solve the issue from that standpoint?
I do think that there are already tools out there that make it sound like you, make your text sound like you, and it's only going to get better. So in the short term, maybe it won't be as good, but I know that in the long term it will, because AI built on itself. It's an exponential tool, so it keeps just getting more and more intelligent. And I'm going to plug in and say, if you haven't watched The AI Dilemma, watch it. It's a documentary by Tristan Harris and Asa Raskin. I watched it twice. It's an hour long, but it's really good work. And yeah, like, not I think by 2024, 2025, and this is me making predictions, it could come before that, but we'll have those kinds of tools. And then it'll be up to us as consumers and up to the companies to say whether or not they want to label this chatbots as human or not, because it will just be so hard for us to tell that they may not have to label it. But it'll come back to regulations, to our own consumer demands, and the company's conscience to say to say, okay, let me tell the truth about this. Is this a bot? There's no one here, or not.
I mean, it seems like, and one of the things we've seen in chatbot world, before we started talking about the AI driven models or smarter chatbots or whatever we want to call them today, but that it was pretty easy to tell when you were caught in a automated discussion, because it was very, very logic tree driven. So you could kind of see that if you went out of a boundary, it couldn't help you, and it would either bounce you out or bounce you to somebody. But in this new world, it seems like with a good GPT engine, large language model integrated into your data, there's a much greater chance that it carries on a conversation in a way that perhaps I wouldn't know. So I'm curious, a couple of things that fall out of that. One of them is, maybe the ethical implication of using it and not disclosing it. And then I wonder if there are legal ramifications to using it in certain situations. Like, do businesses need to do a disclaimer? Do they need to do some transparency thing? And if they do, what's the benefit for them and what's the benefit for the user?
Legal implications. I love the GDPR. I studied for it so much that it's like ingrained in me. But and I know that California has a similar law where you have to, like, as a company, you have to disclose when you're having an algorithm make a decision. So I think legally, like, yes, you definitely have to disclose it.
Actually, I'm going to pop up a question that just came in from the audience that ties exactly into what we're talking about, from a security perspective. Will there ever be a time that sensitive data comes into play for customer service and companies using ChatGPT? And the example that Christy gave was a health insurance company using ChatGPT type functionality to field questions about claims that contain PHI.
I mean,
I think PII.
PII, yeah.
Well, I think personal health information, which is even more sensitive than PII. I think companies should tread lightly there, like, because HIPAA is like one of the strongest laws that we have in the United States, the strongest privacy laws. And we don't have a national privacy law, but we have very strong functional laws, and HIPAA is one of them. So if I were a health company, I would be really careful with that.
Yeah.
I would be, because also there's the fact that maybe they're outsourcing the chatbot, like the building of that model, and like, if you're outsourcing that, you have to have really strong controls with your third-party vendors to make sure that whatever data is there is protected, that all of those things, that go with sharing data. It's I just think it's such a hard thing to do when you don't have that data in house, when you share it with someone else. It just, you lose control over that, and then you can't just say, oh well, that wasn't me, that was this subcontractor. You can't say that. You're liable for any mistakes that they make with that data. So I would be very careful with that.
Well, I see internally, when I think about the complexities of how we're storing how we traditionally store the information in our CRM systems for use in different applications, because that's our system of record for the customer. The complexity that this brings in for the compliance team, right, and the marketing and the sales team, and how you're designating. It's hard enough when I think about being able to leverage information on a person when I'm trying to market to them from a marketing perspective, but now add in the level of, if someone gives me information through a tool that leverages AI, how do we earmark what data, is everything that comes in from that data source, off the table? Like, you can't use it, and does something else supersede that? So if you have a person's preferences stored from, say, a subscription center, yet they come in and they give information through something with a, leveraging an AI model. I mean, the complexity is, it's crazy when I think about what's going to have to happen on that back end.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we've managed to tease this out as complex. I don't think anybody would argue that, and it is, right? But I mean, why? Why would, if I'm a business and it is this complex and it is, pretty murky, I mean, what's the benefit for me and what's the benefit for my customer? Like, why are we having this conversation anyway? Like, do I need to worry about this?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, it goes back, once the hype dies down a little bit, I hope that companies step back and really, gather with their teams, all of the C-suite and all of the data analysts, and really do some cost benefit analysis of, whether this is worth implementing, right? And look, the technology is great, and it's here to stay, and it's only going to get better. So I'm not saying reject technology and let your competitors embrace the technology, but really have, just look at all the scenarios where you lose customers because you're not responding to them. There's no human in the loop, responding to customers. Or the scenario where an algorithm makes a decision for a customer that is an important decision, let's say a loan, employment, hiring, or whatever, and it comes back to the customer that an algorithm made that decision, and you get sued, or there's some kind of regulation that you violated because you let an algorithm make decisions for you. Or what you just mentioned, there was a leak of data, sensitive data, and now you lost the customer's trust, and now you have to focus your resources on complying with an audit from either the EU or the FTC or whatever regulating agency. And not only do you lose trust, you lose business, but you lose, so you have to do a cost benefit analysis. And I'm sure that, maybe ChatGPT can be beneficial for some companies, but maybe not for others. So just do a cost benefit analysis.
We mentioned healthcare. Of course, that's obviously one of the more sensitive areas that we could be having this conversation about. But I just saw recently that, in fact, some healthcare companies are already using algorithms to make decisions, make coverage decisions. And that's definitely not disclosed, or at least it hasn't been obviously talked about that much. So I'm just curious. I mean, and that's not ChatGPT. That's just an algorithm looking at data. Although, I could see where it could easily tie into this conversation. But I mean, there's no. There, is it more of an ethical problem at this point than it is a legal problem? And not that that's a bad thing. I mean, either one of them are bad, but I'm just curious. Do you think it is more of an ethical issue at this point?
Yeah, I think it is, because we don't have the regulation. We don't, at least in the United States, we don't have regulations. We don't have regulations with teeth, right? So the EU is doing the EU AI Act. It's not even in effect yet. And in New York, we have this audit bias law that is for hiring, and we have the AI Bill of Rights that the White House put out a blueprint, and we have the National Institute of Standards and Technology put out something, but we don't have anything that is actually actionable that you can use to prosecute someone. So yeah, now it is an ethical thing, and it's a corporation using its conscience to say, okay, maybe I shouldn't let an algorithm make a decision about a $60,000 health operation for a customer. Maybe it's just a reputational risk.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just like you lose customers and consumers' trust. So yeah.
Christy's on fire today with the questions. Keep them coming, Christy. She just put through, what type of, do you see libel suits coming out of this, and who is accountable for that? I mean, that's the huge question that businesses need to take into consideration.
Yeah, that's again, the professor who was accused of sexual harassment, like, who was accountable for that? Can you sue ChatGPT? Hard to say, but somebody has to. I mean, I feel really bad for that person. And Michael, you had this 2 degrees that came out of nowhere, but that's a good thing. You don't react. You may react positively to that, but what if it was 2 negative things that you found out? Like, what's your recourse? And that's how companies have to think. They have to think in terms of fairness, be transparent, but also liability.
Yeah. I mean, we've certainly gotten a lot of attention over the last few weeks around the idea of this, legal liability, trust, truth, and, particularly around, that idea of suing somebody for libel. And I'm just curious how that plays out. I mean, obviously that situation was driven by people, not by algorithms. So maybe this will make it better. I don't know. But it does seem interesting that there's a lot of sensitivity to it, and yet we know that right now, it's a fancy autocomplete that thinks ahead and predicts ahead based on its own algorithm. So I mean, is that a real risk? Liable? Is that a real risk? I mean, is it going to be in a situation where we're going to let the GPT engine determine the truth in that? I'm just curious what you think.
This, ChatGPT and large language models, they're statistical models, and everything that they do and say, it's based on math, right? And just predicting what's the next thing, what's the next logical thing to say. So it's a tool, it's a technological tool. How do we hold it accountable? It's just it blows my mind how this tool can have so many repercussions on society, on people, and there's nothing stopping it right now. I'm sure there will be regulations, but when? And by the time a regulation comes out, how much more advanced is this tool? so that we have to go back to the drawing board every time.
I almost feel like every day there is, we're going online and checking out the latest headlines, because I'm not sure I've seen such a change on a daily basis in an industry like I'm seeing with the AI tools, right? Usually something will come out and companies are a little bit hesitant, and they get all the ducks in the row before they really dive in. And I feel like this is the complete opposite. This came out, everyone's diving in and looking in the rearview mirror and going, oh, wait a minute, we need to think about this and we need to think about that, and making some pretty significant changes on a daily basis. I mean, it's interesting. It's very interesting how we're adopting this blindly in some ways because of the coolness of the technology and how quickly it can change things. But sometimes that change isn't great.
I mean, it's funny because you think about there aren't a lot of analogs to this in our technology world lately. But I think maybe if you think back to cloud, SaaS, hosted, all of those sort of words that mean I'm using my software from you over the internet somehow. I mean, especially in the beginning, and even when things tipped over 2008, 2009, there were an awful lot of companies that offered something you could use over the internet, but whether it was really SaaS or cloud is a good arguing point that we're probably still arguing about. And I just wonder, what are we doing right now? I can't even tell you the number of new offerings I've come up with lately that are built on some integration to ChatGPT or one of the other language models. So are we in that phase of over extending, and are there going to be repercussions to that?
I want to emphasize how important it is to watch the AI Dilemma. It's on YouTube, and it talks a lot about AI takeoff. Yeah, AI takeoff and AI in like exponential. I forget the exact term, but it's exponential growth. So that means that AI is going to keep like building on its own intelligence, and even AI experts can't predict like how long it'll take for their capabilities to double and triple. And they always overestimate how long it'll take, always. So some AI experts said something like ChatGPT will take longer, right? It will take, let's say, 2027, but it's already here. And then that capability will take another 3 years, but it took like another 2 months.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I mean, there's an old sort of paradigm in technology and technology adoption related to this, the idea that we always underestimate how quickly something's gonna develop, because we tend to apply the same rate of change that we have today into the future. So if it continued at the same pace, we'd be correct. But the chances are, like most technologies, it accelerates exponentially based on each advance, which means that we almost always overestimate when that's actually going to take effect. And it seems like we're sort of in that zone right now, right?
I feel like we're going to see a whole new segment of law degrees popping up all around AI specifically. So for those of you going to school right now, you may want to think about an AI law degree.
I mean,
I think we have to rethink higher education in general.
Yeah.
Like,
I agree.
I think kids, when I say kids, I mean 18-year-olds. I think they're already rethinking everything, and which is a good thing. Before you invest $100,000 in college, really think about what's going to happen with AI.
We are up against the clock right now, but I wanted to bring in one quick question that was just asked from the audience in terms of all of the countries that are making different attempts at regulating, large language models. Do you think we should have more central regulations, or should every country and region be able to regulate them based on what affects them specifically? What are your thoughts?
That's a great question. And I know that the UN is already working on some kind of framework, but universal is hard to say because you have China, right? Second biggest economy. And they put out their own AI framework. And have you read it? It's very tailored to China, right? It says, and I have it up right here, and of course I'm not going to read it, but it says only like we can only like AI can only be used to further socialism, to further our own way of government, way of life. That's a rough translation, but it's very different from what the EU AI Act says, and very different from whatever we have put out here in the United States. So I don't see that happening without the biggest players out there. And remember that different countries have different capabilities. So the EU, the US, China, Japan, maybe Korea, they're very much advanced economies. But then you have the global South, right? And the global South may not be there, right? And when they get there, they may not want to conform to this framework that was done by the advanced economies. They might want to take a different approach. So maybe we could talk about it. We can talk about universal laws or agreements, but I don't know that it's going to be done anytime soon with the agreement of all the big players, and that it's going to have any teeth.
Interesting. I mean, that's an area that I'd love to dig into a little bit more. Unfortunately, we are actually more than out of time at this point. And this is a conversation and a discussion I think that we could easily continue because it is certainly very timely. But I think it's all the time we have today. Soribel, you survived the hot seat. And I think for the audience in general, if you think you have what it takes to be in the hot seat, let us know because we'd love to hear from you. That's In the Hot Seat for today. Thanks so much for being with us. I'm Michael Fauscette.
And I'm Jody Spencer. Be sure to tune in next time. We're going to have some different faces, different topics, and different perspectives when we put someone else in the hot seat. Thank you, Soribel.
Thanks
for joining.
Thanks so much for having me.